Oxford, Ohio, a picturesque little college town, home to Miami University, with red brick buildings, lush fall colors, and the peaceful rhythm of academic life. In 1978, the community moved like clockwork, quiet, predictable, safe. That's why when Elizabeth Beth Andes, a bright, bubbly 23-year-old student, was found brutally murdered inside her apartment, the town's sense of safety shattered overnight. Beth had just graduated early. She was working, apartment hunting with her boyfriend, preparing for her next steps in life. But none of that would matter after December 28th. That night, Beth's boyfriend, Bob Young, returned to her small apartment and found her lifeless body on the bedroom floor. She had been strangled with a cord, her skull battered, her blouse torn. Yet nothing was stolen. Nothing valuable was missing. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't random. Someone had wanted her dead, and within 24 hours, police zeroed in on Bob Young. The murder seemed solved, but decades later, after podcasts, reinvestigations, and DNA testing, the case would only get more twisted, more mysterious, and far more chilling than anyone could have expected.
After discovering Elizabeth's body, Bob Young did what any grieving partner might. He called 911, shaking, crying, panicking. But within hours, he was no longer just a witness. He was the prime suspect. Police quickly brought him in for questioning, and that night, Bob confessed. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. He said he killed her after a fight, that she wanted to leave, that he couldn't handle it. But there was a problem. The evidence didn't match his words. No defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, no blood on his clothing, no fingerprints, and worse, he later claimed he didn't even remember saying it. According to Bob, the confession had been dragged out of him during hours of pressure from police. No lawyer, no sleep, no clarity. His voice had cracked. His mind had caved. He said what they wanted to hear. He recanted, but the damage was already done. The town had heard what they needed. The case was closed in the public eye. But beneath that rushed confession was something no one saw coming. The real killer was likely still out there.
The trial began quickly, almost too quickly. Prosecutors had their story. Bob Young killed his girlfriend in a fit of rage, but the defense argued something wasn't right. There were no signs of a forced entry, no proof Bob had been violent, no forensic evidence tying him to the murder. And yet, his words, the confession, loomed like a specter. Jurors listened, but they squinted. Even they seemed unsure. How could someone confess to such a brutal act and then seem so lost afterward? There was no clear motive. No weapon was ever found. No timeline that truly made sense. Then came the shock. The jury acquitted Bob Young. After just hours of deliberation, the case collapsed. Bob walked free. And Oxford, Ohio was left with a haunting realization. They had no killer, no answers, and a woman brutally murdered with no justice at all. After Bob Young's acquittal, the case faded into silence. Elizabeth Andes was buried. Her name slowly vanished from headlines. The apartment she was murdered in was rented out again. Life moved on. But her family never believed the case was truly solved. They knew Bob, knew he wasn't capable of what the police said he'd done. They believed someone else had walked free. For years, their questions went unanswered. The Oxford police closed the file. No need to look further, they said, but decades later, new voices began to whisper again. In 2016, a group of journalists from the Cincinnati Enquirer began digging through Elizabeth's murder for their true crime podcast, Accused. What they found was chilling. Files that had never been fully reviewed. Witnesses who were never interviewed. A police investigation that seemed more rushed than real. They uncovered possible suspects who were never even questioned. And timelines that didn't match Bob's at all. The podcast sparked a firestorm. Millions of listeners. National attention. Elizabeth's story was alive again. The deeper the podcast team dug, the darker the shadows became. They found names that had once floated on the edges of police records. Neighbors, maintenance workers, ex-boyfriends. Some had criminal records. Some had no alibi. Some, astonishingly, were never even questioned. One maintenance man had a key to every apartment in the building. Another neighbor told police she heard screaming the night Elizabeth died, but her statement was never followed up. And then there was the roommate. She had been out of town the weekend of the murder, but her story changed more than once. The timeline that once seemed simple, Bob finds Elizabeth, confesses, end of story, now looked riddled with holes. The podcast even uncovered inconsistencies in how the police handled evidence. Logs went missing. Files were misplaced. One officer admitted he didn't even remember how the crime scene was secured. If Bob didn't do it, someone else did. But with nearly 4 decades gone, would anyone ever pay the price? Elizabeth Andes was buried in the winter of 1978. Her killer was never charged, never named, and her name became a whisper, spoken only by her family, by a few who remembered, and by strangers who heard her story through headphones decades later. Her case remains unsolved. Bob Young went on with his life, but he never escaped suspicion. The police department never reopened the case. The roommate never spoke publicly again. And Elizabeth, she became one of thousands, murdered women whose stories never found a conclusion. What's most haunting is not the brutality of her death. It's the silence afterward. In a world full of stories, some are never finished. Elizabeth Andes deserved answers, but all she got was silence. If you were gripped by her story, subscribe to Twilight Vaulted Tales, where truth is always more terrifying than fiction. We dig up the darkest unsolved mysteries, the most chilling real-life hauntings,